Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing some Stalin, paper 2. Let's get into it. Don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. Okay, so we're going to be talking about rise to power first off. I think this might be a two-parter because I don't have a lot of charge. Okay, so we're talking about rise to power with Stalin. What were some of the positions that he held? Well, first off, he was the People's Commissar for Minorities in 1917. This was under Lenin because Lenin felt that since he was a Georgian, Stalin might have a better understanding of minorities in the country. He was the liaison officer between the Org Bureau and the Politburo in 1919, and also the head of the Peasants and Workers Inspectorate in 1919. And in 1922, he was the General Secretary to the Communist Party. So as you can see, he held a lot of really important roles within the party and also socially. So he had an understanding of what the public was like at the time, and what the party, what the movement of the party was, what they were opposed to, what they believed in. So he was able to really easily maneuver between factions, and also he had the power of patronage. He could, give people positions if they were loyal to him, if they supported him. So that was a really important element of his campaign. As a matter of fact, historian Lee says that among Stalin's political advantages was his ability to maneuver between factions, which he does do, and we're going to talk about that now in Rise to Power. So let's talk about Stalin in terms of opposition. Who was Stalin's biggest opposition at the time? Well, first off, we're going to hit Trotsky. So who was Trotsky? Well, we've been overly on Trotsky with the Russian Civil War under Lenin. I think I made a video on that. If I didn't, I'm screwed. Under Lenin. And he was basically, a very strategic person. He wasn't initially a Bolshevik. He came to Russia. He'd studied abroad. He came to Russia and he was like, oh, okay. And he experimented a bit, and then he was like, yeah, Bolshevism sounds good. And he became a Bolshevik. Obviously, that also kind of affected his, his following, his support around Stalin's time after Lenin's death, because people were like, oh, well, he wasn't even sure about his ideology. So they, were a bit polarized. Apart from that, Trotsky was also a Jew, and at the time there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia. So, he felt under pressure. He also rejected a post for Commissar of War under Lenin in 1917 because he felt that the party would be criticized for having a Jew, headed. So, I'm not going to do it. Okay. Right, so we're still, right, Trotsky. He was also very flamboyant and brilliant, and he was described as dangerously ambitious by other members of the party, so people tended to perceive him as a bit of an outsider to the CPSU, which is what the Communist Party was known as at the time. Now let's talk about Trotsky against Stalin. So they had a lot of ideological differences, and in my personal opinion, might not be true, but I feel as though some of Stalin's ideology wasn't inherently even his. It was just made that way to oppose Trotsky's ideology, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So at the time of Lenin's death, when there's all this fighting between the factions in the 1920s, Stalin wants to maneuver his way into power, and one of the most important factors was that the NEP, the new economic policy, was still in place. So there was a lot of controversy about whether to keep it or to abandon it, because if you don't know, the NEP was extremely capitalist. Well, not extremely, but compared to what, Tsarist, the Romanov dynasty, it was capitalist in nature. And that maybe that might have worked under Tsarism because that was autocratic and, it was like a monarchy. But now you've got this brand new radical communist party coming in, and they're already a bit feeble and insecure. So to them, to have capitalist elements is their ideology at the moment is their biggest strength. So to have something chip away at that within the nation is detrimental, okay? That's a cool aspect of it to look into, I think. Right. So what were some of the differences in their ideology? Well, Trotsky was an international Marxist. He believed in the idea of exporting the communist revolution abroad. He believed that the Soviet Union, or Russia, couldn't survive in a hostile world, and that Russia was only the first step in a much larger global revolution. However, Stalin, soon after, comes up with the idea of socialism in one country, that it was more important to consolidate Lenin's revolution in Russia and modernize Russia to compete with other nations before exporting the revolution. So that's what I kind of meant, because it seems like Stalin's ideology centered around disproving Trotsky, just for the sake of it, right? But obviously, you could argue either way. It could be a very superficial thing. Okay, right. Historian Lynch believes that Stalin won because Trotsky lacked a power base, which seems kind of realistic considering the fact that Trotsky was quite opposed to. He was a bit of a pariah to the party, but Stalin was more in power. He was more influential in the party, you could argue, to some extent. Right, okay. Let's talk about, what are we going to talk about now? Let's talk about how Stalin gets rid of Trotsky. Well, Trotsky, he sort of denounces Stalin's collectivization program, and he says, no, wait, I'm sorry. That was so off. He denounces the NEP, and he says that, this clearly isn't the direction we should be taking. We should be doing more harsh collectivization like we did with war communism. Trotsky was a huge fan of war communism. He believed that peasants should not be cosseted. So, his ideology was that way. But Stalin went, oh no, I think we should keep the new economic policy. Lenin did it. Lenin was great. Again, you could talk about glorification of a leader, but so Stalin insists on this. And because Trotsky has now openly gone against communist beliefs, Stalin now has a reason to be like, oh, we should kick him out, which they do end up doing in 1927, I believe. So Trotsky is removed from his post as Commissar of War in 1927. And how is this done? So, I don't know if you remember, but Zinoviev and Kamenev are two figures in the party who support Stalin when he wants to when he wants to remove Trotsky. But all that does is that it proves to Stalin that these two people actually hold such a position of power that they're able to remove someone. So he's like, oh, this is my next threat. And what ends up happening is quite ironic, actually, because Zinoviev and Kamenev, they go, well, actually, the results of the NEP they aren't really showing anything great. I think we should, change our plan. We should try something different. And that's really just a chip off the old block of Trotskyism. But Stalin still opposes it, and he says, okay, well, now I have reason to remove you from the party. They are removed from the party. Really quickly, we're just going to wrap it up because I don't have much charge. Now comes the right. So who were the people constituting the right? The right at the time was extremely scared of the ban on factionalism that Lenin had set up, so they weren't able to vocalize their concerns as much, which is why Stalin kind of portrayed them as a weaker faction or wing. From the right, you had Tomsky, Rykov, and Bukharin. Bukharin in 1928 opposes Stalin's collectivization. Opposes Stalin's collectivization publicly. And so what ends up happening is Bukharin is removed from the Politburo, and Rykov is superseded as premier by Molotov. So by 1928, Stalin has basically rid himself of all opposition, and right opportunists, such as the ones listed above, are only allowed to stay on after admitting to the error of their ways, and Stalin essentially becomes a vozhd, or a communist czar. And that brings us to a wrap on Rise of Stalin to Power. I'm going to go get a charger, and we're going to continue this in part 2. So, thank you for watching.